What happens to a society when war stops being something distant and extraordinary, and instead quietly becomes a daily fact of life? Around the battered city of Kupiansk in eastern Ukraine, the conflict has settled into a relentless, grinding pattern. Ukrainian defenders cling to the city's southern fringes, their resolve tested each day as Russian forces slowly but surely squeeze the perimeter. Every street, every cellar is searched and cleared, yet the outcome feels almost predetermined. It is less a battle than a slow, inexorable countdown, measured not only in days and casualties, but in the patience of both sides wearing thin. This is not a frozen front, however, as in the Korean peninsula after the 1950s armistice, or in the long stalemated trenches of World War I. Here, fighting is restless and unpredictable. Combatants slip through neighborhoods masquerading as civilians, passing checkpoints with forged documents and borrowed clothing. Each encounter is fraught with risk. A refugee might be a desperate family seeking safety, or a camouflaged soldier bringing new danger. The boundaries between soldier and civilian, between safety and threat, are as unstable and shifting as the war itself. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away from the shelling and the shattered buildings, the world's attention has shifted. Headlines that once tracked every advance with arrows on maps now focus on debates in Western capitals. Instead of urgent dispatches from the front, the news is filled with negotiations over military aid packages and red lines that may or may not be crossed. Rumors swirl of advanced American Tomahawk cruise missiles already present on Ukrainian soil, even as lawmakers argue whether sending such weapons will escalate the conflict or simply cement a war of attrition. In these distant chambers, the questions are less about how to win and more about how much longer support can be sustained, and at what political and economic cost. The human toll, however, is growing harder to ignore. Official reports confirm that more than 40 British citizens have been killed fighting in Ukraine, but independent estimates suggest the real number could reach into the hundreds or even thousands. France faces similar reckonings, with foreign volunteers and military advisors caught between heroism, controversy, and tragedy. Families at home are left to grapple with the real price of solidarity. The lives lost, the futures traded for uncertain ideals, and the wounds, both physical and psychological, that may never fully heal. If we tune out, if we let the war fade into the background, we risk missing how it transforms economies, societies, and even the very idea of what comes after. This is no longer just about territory. It is about trust, identity, and the possibility of peace when war becomes the default condition. But beneath this uneasy normalcy, deeper transformations are unfolding. They reach into homes, into wallets, and into the bonds of trust that hold entire societies together. The war's new shape is easy to overlook, yet impossible to dismiss. Take Kupiansk as an example. Russian troops now occupy almost the entire right bank of the city. Only scattered groups of Ukrainian defenders remain, many stranded and desperately low on supplies. Some risk a harrowing escape through dense forests, hoping to reach friendly lines. Others, seeing no way out, surrender rather than face certain death or capture. This pattern echoes the encirclements of Stalingrad in World War II, though on a smaller scale, reminding us that the logic of siege and attrition has changed little over the past century. Russian units push forward, block by block, painstakingly clearing neighborhoods and rooting out resistance. Their vigilance is justified. Ukrainian soldiers, sometimes shedding their uniforms, try to slip past checkpoints disguised as refugees or locals. The consequences of failure are severe, but for many, the alternative, a hopeless stand or anonymous grave, is even worse. Against this relentless backdrop, Western capitals are gripped by a growing debate. Should they provide Ukraine with powerful new weapons, such as American-made Tomahawk cruise missiles? In Washington, the question hangs in the air, caught between political factions and gridlocked committees. There is no timetable, no agreement, only mounting uncertainty. Retired American generals urge caution, recalling the lessons of Vietnam and Afghanistan. They argue for a measured response. use advanced arms to strike Russian military-industrial sites, not civilian centers deep inside Russia. Their reasoning is calculated. Strategic pressure, not reckless escalation, might shift the war's momentum without triggering unpredictable retaliation. Meanwhile, London and Paris inch closer to direct involvement. British and French authorities are not just discussing aid, they are quietly sending more personnel. Training missions, Foreign Legion detachments, and so-called advisors are moving from plans to deployment, blurring the line between support and intervention. Major news outlets, including Bloomberg, report that the British government is preparing multi-million-pound operations. These are not mere gestures. Logistics, fleet support, and air operations are being put in place, signaling a serious, long-term commitment. The old boundaries between indirect help and direct participation are fading, as they did before the escalation of the Vietnam War, when American advisors gradually gave way to ground troops. Hidden within these maneuvers is a dangerous risk. If any side misreads the level or permanence of international backing, the consequences could be catastrophic. History is full of such miscalculations. The outbreak of World War I, for instance, was triggered by a misreading of alliances and deterrence. The very definition of involvement is evolving step by step, from sending weapons to putting boots on the ground. Yet while officials and strategists debate next moves, another truth is emerging, one measured not in policy but in mounting exhaustion and cost, felt both on the front lines and far from the battlefield. The war's new phase is marked not by sweeping victories, but by attrition and ambiguity. This grinding uncertainty is testing the resolve and the patience of everyone involved. With every new dispatch from the front, unease spreads far beyond the battlefield. How much longer can ordinary people bear these invisible wounds, as the costs, measured in lives, trust, and money, keep mounting? History offers sobering examples. During World War I, enthusiasm gave way to despair as the stalemate dragged on, reshaping entire generations. Officially, the United Kingdom admits to just over 40 citizens killed in Ukraine. But behind official statements, independent estimates whisper a far darker reality. As many as 1,000 British lives may have been lost. For families back home, the grief is compounded by silence, and by the haunting question of why their loved ones went so far from home to die. Even as casualties climb, both Britain and France are quietly preparing for a long-term role in Ukraine. This is no longer a series of limited missions or symbolic gestures. In secret meetings, officials draft plans for military commitments that could last for years. The message is clear. This war is not ending soon. Back home, the mood is shifting. Where once the media rallied behind the cause, reporters now voice open doubts. Stories about lost volunteers, spiraling expenses, and uncertain objectives dominate headlines. What was once seen as a just fight now feels tangled in confusion and ambiguity. In cities and towns across the United Kingdom and France, daily life is being reshaped by the war's reach. Economic pain bites harder, prices rise, pension strikes erupt, and bitter arguments over national priorities fill the news. As billions are funneled abroad, people wonder what is being neglected at home and whether the sacrifice is worth it. Personal tragedies fuel public anxiety. Some reports claim that as many as 1 in 5 British volunteers in Ukraine have not returned. Each missing person leaves behind not just a number, but a family in limbo and a community asking why. Western societies now face a painful reckoning. How do you justify endless sacrifice when the outcome is so uncertain? As the toll grows but clarity fades, faith in leaders begins to fray. The real risk is not just more loss, but the slow unraveling of trust and the rise of quiet resentment. Such moments have altered nations before. Consider the anti-war movements during the Vietnam War, when mounting casualties and unclear goals led to mass protests and political upheaval in the United States and Europe. Meanwhile, the conflict itself has changed. The swift offensives of earlier days have given way to a brutal war of attrition. On both sides, progress is measured in inches, and the meaning of victory grows ever more elusive. As the fighting grinds on, both soldiers and civilians are forced to adapt to a new, harsher reality. The next phase of the war will test not just armies, but the patience and resilience of entire societies. When victory is out of reach and defeat is unthinkable, what do both sides truly want? What happens when the gunfire finally fades, if it ever does? Russia shifts its tactics. Instead of spectacular assaults, it opts for constant pressure, targeting Ukraine's supply routes, power plants, and key roads. The aim is not quick conquest, but slow, grinding exhaustion, a war of nerves and attrition. For Ukrainian towns and cities, this means rolling blackouts, shattered highways, and a growing tide of families seeking refuge wherever they can find it. Every week, the strain deepens. Hospitals fight to keep lights on and equipment running. Classrooms turn into crowded shelters. Neighborhoods adjust to a daily rhythm of scarcity, disruption, and fear, as more people are forced from homes that may never be safe again. The cost is counted not just in the wounded or dead, but in the gradual unraveling of daily life itself. This echoes the slow-motion disintegration seen in places like Syria, where years of conflict hollowed out once thriving communities, and the scars remain long after the guns fall silent. Western experts sound the alarm. Ukraine's resistance depends on steady lifelines from abroad. If shipments of ammunition, diesel, and cash falter, the struggle could slow, not toward peace, but toward a frozen stalemate, where suffering becomes invisible and the world quietly looks away. Some foresee a war that drags on for years, headlines dwindling even as hardship spreads. The Balkan Wars of the 1990s offer a cautionary tale. International attention wanes, but the suffering of ordinary people continues. Diplomatic channels remain open, yet mostly silent. Both sides wait, gambling that the other will tire first, run out of resources, or lose the will to fight. Official talks stall, while secret negotiations flicker in the background, rarely changing the bigger picture. The threat of sudden escalation never truly disappears, even as global attention shifts elsewhere. Meanwhile, in European capitals, leaders debate new aid packages and the possible dispatch of military trainers or technical advisors. Budget woes and street protests make these decisions harder. Governments weigh the costs, anxious to avoid new crises at home while still honoring promises abroad. Ordinary Ukrainians adapt to a suspended life. Another winter of rationing, missed reunions, and daily uncertainty. Across Europe and America, war fatigue deepens. News coverage shrinks as other concerns fill the headlines. Sympathy gives way to exhaustion, and political isolationism quietly spreads. The Spanish Civil War, once a rallying cry for international volunteers, eventually faded from headlines, leaving a nation to rebuild in silence and isolation. But the gravest peril may no longer be on the battlefield. If leaders and citizens fail to plan for what comes next, Ukraine could face years, perhaps generations, of economic ruin, political turmoil, and splintered communities. Recovery will take more than money or weapons. It will demand patience, vision, and commitment from a world that is already weary. Post-war reconstruction in places like Iraq and Afghanistan has shown that rebuilding is not merely a matter of bricks and mortar, but of trust, governance, and social healing. Without a roadmap for the future, the scars of war risk becoming permanent. So what is left to do, by governments and by ordinary people, when waiting for a clear ending is no longer an option? What might a path forward look like when hope is scarce and the old certainties are gone? The answer may depend on choices made now, both large and small. For governments, this means not only sustaining aid, but also investing in long-term reconstruction plans, supporting civil society, and encouraging dialogue between divided communities. For individuals, it may mean supporting refugees, volunteering for humanitarian organizations, and keeping the conversation alive in public spaces so that the conflict does not fade into obscurity. When conflict becomes routine, the hardest struggle is not survival, but imagining what comes next and daring to build it. The war's greatest test is fought less with weapons than with endurance. For millions, the battle is internal. How to keep faith in peace, in trust, in a future that still feels possible. Years of uncertainty have seeped into daily life, making hope itself feel like a risk. Yet without hope, the possibility of rebuilding is lost. Reconstruction will demand more than slogans or foreign aid. The task ahead is painstaking, not just rebuilding bridges and homes, but also shattered communities, fractured relationships, and minds worn thin by grief. Real healing unfolds over decades, not months, and rarely follows a headline's rhythm. The Marshall Plan, launched after World War II, rebuilt Europe not just with money, but with a vision of shared prosperity and reconciliation. Ukraine will need something similar, a comprehensive effort that addresses not only infrastructure, but also education, mental health, and the rebuilding of trust between citizens and institutions. Yet even in exhaustion, hope flickers. In Ukraine and beyond, volunteers gather supplies, reopen classrooms, and patch up clinics. Online, a new vocabulary emerges, one that speaks of dialogue, compromise, and the distant possibility of peace. Political conversations in Western capitals, once locked in certainty, now show cracks. Some leaders quietly question whether endless escalation is truly inevitable. In the United States, members of Congress debate the wisdom of continued escalation, recalling the lessons of past interventions that dragged on without resolution. Governments walk a perilous tightrope, supporting allies overseas while tending to unrest at home. Ignoring public fatigue does not just cost political favor, it erodes trust in entire institutions. If war weariness festers, the foundations of political legitimacy may begin to crumble. The collapse of support for the First World War in Russia, for example, helped spark revolution and reshape the course of the 20th century. Look at today's headlines, or the anxious scrawl of online debate. From battered villages to distant metropolises, more voices ask not who will win, but who will heal, and how. The longing is not for another offensive, but for a way out. Lasting peace cannot be brokered by a treaty alone. It requires a new social contract, an honest reckoning with trauma, and a commitment to rebuild what was lost, materially and in spirit. If these wounds remain unhealed, then history's cycle will return, repeating its cost in a new generation. Miss the moment, and the ghosts of old wars will shape tomorrow's choices. The most difficult battles may be those that begin after the guns go silent. But even as exhaustion grows, the world's gaze remains fixed on the battlefield. The next act pivots on whether leaders and citizens can break free of old patterns, or remain trapped in them. When war feels endless, perhaps the bravest act is to imagine peace, and demand that leaders make it more than a distant promise. After years of fighting in Ukraine, the border between victory and defeat has faded into a gray, uncertain territory. Headlines still flash with new weapons and shifting alliances, but for millions, the war is no longer a far-off crisis. It is woven into daily life, steadily shaping fears, hopes, and even the quiet moments between them. The true cost of a never-ending conflict cannot be counted in spreadsheets or casualty reports. It is felt in broken trust, struggling economies, and a growing exhaustion that seeps into every conversation, every plan for the future. Each month that passes without resolution makes it harder to imagine a world where peace is possible, and harder to believe in the leaders who promise it. This burden is not limited to those living near the front lines. Whether we are 1,000 kilometers away or only a few, governments tighten their grip in the name of security. Families grow distant under the weight of constant anxiety. Children learn to see violence as just another part of the background, as ordinary as tomorrow's forecast. Sociologists warn that the normalization of violence can have profound effects on generations, shaping attitudes and behavior in ways that persist long after the fighting ends. Yet it does not have to be this way. The path to real victory is not paved with more offensives or grand negotiations, but with a shared refusal to let endless war become the new normal. It means demanding that peace is more than a ceasefire, that it is the work of rebuilding trust, healing invisible scars, and allowing ordinary people to believe in something better. If we ignore this moment, if we allow war to fade into the fabric of daily life, we risk giving up our future to more endless, unwinnable conflicts. We risk losing the very ability to imagine what peace could look like. That, in the end, would be the deepest defeat of all. As this chapter closes, one question lingers. Will we let war define us, or will we demand more, from our leaders and from ourselves? The answer lies not in the hands of generals or politicians alone, but in the collective will of societies to seek a different path, to repair what has been broken, and to insist that peace, however distant or difficult, is always worth fighting for. And so, as the world holds its breath, the responsibility falls to each of us, to remember, to imagine, and to act. Because the end of war is never just the silence of guns, but the beginning of a new story, one that we must choose to write together.